Hi, this is Alex. In this video, I'm going to show you how to paint this picture of some mangosteens. Here's a reference photo if you want to paint along or paint on your own. And in this case, I decided to do something a little different than I usually do. I decided because I've never kind of drawn these or painted these fruit, I wanted to do a little study in pencil first. And the reason for that was because I wanted to really kind of break apart the structure of them, particularly the tops, the way the little leaves kind of sit on top of the fruit. And it also sort of helps to establish the composition, make sure that you're in the right place. The purpose of this drawing is not to have a pretty drawing at the end. It's really more of a internal purpose, and that is to kind of understand things and figure things out. So, it's okay if this drawing doesn't come out great. I'm not going to be using it for anything besides my own personal sort of understanding of the subject. I mean, obviously the overall shape is pretty simple. They're just circles, and they cast very simple shadows. But once you get into the little details at the top and the way kind of the light hits them, that's when things become a little bit more interesting, and there's things to kind of figure out. There's also, there's little details here and there that are important to kind of understand, in that, how do the shadows interact with each other? Is there space between the different shadows? What is the overall shape of them? And because we're not using paint and just using a pencil, and by the way, this is a 2B mechanical pencil. Yeah, 2B. It's pretty soft. I can get some pretty dark strokes with it. But anyway, because we're not dealing with color here and just dealing with line and tone, it's a good opportunity to work out, all of the little kind of nuances in structure and tone and shape and all that stuff. So once I have that, then what happens is you have something kind of imprinted in your brain because you've sort of went over every surface of the subject and really took the time to understand it. Then when I paint, when I'm painting, I'm not dealing with lines and contours. I'm dealing more with surfaces and shapes. But those lines and contours are going to be imprinted in my brain, and I'll be able to sort of refer back to my mental image of these, and when I apply my strokes, they'll go on in a certain way that is indicative of the form and the structure that I have studied before painting. And while these kind of drawings are generally not not intended to be a finished product, you'll find that if you have a different purpose to drawing, a purpose that is beyond just making a drawing look good, a lot of times you actually get much better results. Like, you get results that sort of have a hint of a different purpose to them, and therefore something a little bit less blunt and a little bit, if not more mysterious, but more something with slightly different value behind it. So we'll see how this one comes out. And when I do wind up painting, I'm not going to be looking at this drawing. The only purpose this drawing serves is for me to kind of capture that image in my brain and have that have that in my repertoire, kind of in my subconscious when I'm painting. Um, Artists do that a lot with figure drawing. They'll spend years and years studying the figure just with charcoal or pencil, and before they start painting. And then when you start painting, then you have all the vocabulary in your in your brain, so you know how muscles look, you know how you've drawn an arm 100 different times in 100 different positions, and so it sort of it gives you kind of like a little vocabulary to refer back to when you're painting. So um, you don't have to worry about drawing with a paintbrush. You can be really painting surfaces, painting shapes, and that drawing will come through the painting, and you'll be able to see that there's good drawing structure underneath the painting. Somehow you can't even tell why, but it's there, and anybody who draws, anybody who paints will be able to tell as well. But most importantly, you'll be able to tell. So that's kind of the purpose here, is just to kind of solidify my drawing a little bit. I don't do as much drawing as I used to, just because I'm kind of used to painting and used to painting, drawing with my paint and finding shapes in sort of 3 dimensions rather than in contour. So a lot of times when I paint, I'll do a very, very rough and very basic sketch with one color before going into the actual shapes and the fields of color. And a lot of times that drawing is going to be, it's going to be just an indication of where things are rather than an accurate contour, for example. So what I've done there with those lines across the surface of the mangosteens is I've defined where the edge between the light and shadow is. And while there's a subtle gradation and subtle kind of shift in color or in tone between the light and shadow, it's good to identify that that line of where it sits, because then you can kind of organize yourself and say, okay, nothing in the shadow is going to be as bright in tone as the things that are in the light, and vice versa. You're not going to have anything as dark in the light area as you would in the shadow. And now that I've worked out the overall shapes of the left and right mangosteen tops, I'm gonna kind of finalize this front one, and then same thing with the little leaves. Each one of the shapes are gonna have a light and a dark, unless that shape is completely in shadow, or it's if it's completely in light, you'll still have a dark and a light, because there will be places where light does not reach. And now I'm just kind of establishing the overall dark shapes in the painting, and the mangosteens themselves are actually overall going to be darker than the background. So the background is kind of light; it's sort of a blue color, and then the surface is a light wood, and the mangosteens are going to be the darkest part of it. And you'll notice that I switched the way I'm holding the pencil. You should try not to hold the pencil like you would hold a pen when you're writing, because that's for really fine detail, and it's not really necessary here. I did want to kind of work out exactly how the top of that one looks like, so I kind of switched it around, but generally hold the pencil like you would hold like this, like like you would hold a paintbrush. and apply strokes that way, keeping things loose, keeping things fluid, and sort of the motion, for the most part, should come from the arm, the forearm, rather than the wrist, because the wrist tends to be like, especially as you're doing like these bigger kind of shapes, the wrist tends to have a much smaller radius, and therefore it's a lot more, it's a lot less forgiving, and it's just a little too precise for what we're doing here. And I'm also thinking about, as I'm drawing, I'm also thinking about what I'm going to do when I'm painting. So I'm establishing, okay, these little spots underneath each one of them, there's a, that's my darkest dark. That's where the least amount of light reaches. And so I'm going to block those in very quickly as darks. And then continue working around and establishing my shadows, my darks, versus my lights. Then when I paint, those areas that are the darkest are gonna get paint first, and then I'll move from the darkest to the lightest gradually. So this is kind of like laying out a plan for me of what I'm gonna do once I get into painting. There is also a spot on the mangosteen where the shadow is going to be the darkest, and that's going to be away from the surface, and more towards the transition between the light and dark. Partially because there's a reflected light that comes up from the surface and reflects into the mangosteen, into the shadow. But also what's going to happen is that that edge between the light and dark on the top is going to seem the darkest because that's the biggest contrast between the light and dark. And the one thing to note about the scale of this drawing is it's exactly 1-to-1 to the size of the painting that I'm going to be doing. So I'm going to be painting 6 by 8 inches. And so all I did was I traced the board on top of this paper. And so, that helps me realize what size, what's the composition going to be exactly 1-to-1 once I begin painting. Now I'm also noticing kind of the difference in tone between the edges of the different subjects. So like what's the tone between the light part of this front mangosteen compared to the the shadow of the one that's right behind it, and trying to figure out what's the difference. And it's not exact tone, obviously, but it's it's a cartoonized version of that transition. But it sort of helps me to understand, okay, this one's going to be darker, this one's going to be lighter. How does it change as it goes down? Does the reflected light at the bottom of that left mangosteen does it begin to become a little brighter than the fall off and the shadow of the mangosteen in the front? And it doesn't, but anyway. And as I mentioned, the mangosteen is actually going to be the darkest part of the painting, and so I want to try and reflect that so that even the lightest parts of these guys are going to be still darker than the background. And they're not really shiny, so there's not going to be a very bright highlight. There's going to be a little bit of a highlight, but not a very bright one. So overall, it's going to be these kind of 3 dark shapes in the middle of the painting. And I'm using a gum eraser to bring up some of those light parts. All right, so then let's get into this painting. I have my colors laid out. I'm using titanium white, some cad yellow, yellow ochre. I have some cadmium red, medium, alizarin crimson, burnt sienna, burnt umber, and some ultramarine blue. And I may or may not use some cerulean blue as well, which is kind of a lighter, kind of cooler version of blue. So now that I've figured out exactly where things are in my composition, here everything's a lot easier. It's not, I'm not trying to do it exactly the way I did on my sketch, but, obviously this is going to be slightly different, a different composition because I'm looking at a different surface. There's edges to it, so things might change a little bit compared to what I did in the drawing. But I have a good foundation, and so I can start. Like the very first sort of sketch that I did, the mangosteens felt like they were a little bit high in the composition, so I'm going to bring them down just a little bit, maybe a little bit over to the right. And I'm using a little bit of burnt umber and some ultramarine blue as my drawing kind of color, and mixed with a generous amount of linseed oil to kind of water it down, make it feel a little bit more like a line drawing and not apply too much paint because I don't want to be fighting with it later on. And you can see that I'm very, very loose with my drawing. Now I'm just kind of establishing the general direction of each one of these fruit. Where does the top sit compared to the body? I'm using a 6x8 toned gessoed panel. So what I did was I used some of my paint at the end of a painting session, sort of battle with white. A lot of times you'll start painting and then there'll be like a pesky little drop of white in between two kind of surfaces, and this just helps to alleviate that. Even if I leave some of this color, it's not going to feel completely foreign on the painting. Whereas white, like pure white gesso, is definitely going to feel like it doesn't belong in the composition. Like the brightest whites should really be your highlights, and even those are not going to be completely white, but sort of toned down with some other color. So you can see here I'm not focused too much on the details of those tops. Just generally kind of laying out where each one of the leaves is at, and overall that's enough for my drawing. Because once I get into a little further into the painting and get into the details, then all those kind of lights and shadows and the fine details are going to come into play. So now I've added a little bit of alizarin crimson right underneath, or sort of that little place where the mangosteen is touching the surface. That's the darkest part. And then I'm just using the same color and just scumbling it around onto the other places of the mangosteen as a kind of a base color. The mangosteens, they're kind of an interesting fruit. They have it's not a very solid color. You can see many different colors as you kind of look at the surface, and so you have to think about, okay, well, how am I going to build this collection of textures? So I want to have a base color that's darker, and I'm going to start adding some lighter colors on top of that, and I continue building on top of the surface in order to create the texture that I want. And before I get too far down the rabbit hole of painting the mangosteens themselves, I want to put something down for the background color. And that's just going to help me with figuring out what the tones are, because I started with this very dark color, but it didn't, it's sort of, it could be right, it could be wrong. Unless I have something to compare it to, it's very hard to tell. So I'm mixing up kind of a light blue, like turquoise kind of blue, and I've used some ultramarine white, some cerulean blue, and some yellow yellow ochre in there. And then once I put it down on the surface, I can kind of see whether that feels right or not. And again, right now I'm not focused on too much details. It's really just an overall kind of just kind of like little spots of color to give me some point of comparison. And I'm not just using one color just to fill in the entire background. I'm kind of giving it a little bit of variations. Some of this is done just to make things a little bit more interesting, and sometimes you'll apply a color that is too cool, for example, like a blue that's too cool, and you want to bring it up more towards the towards the reds. And so instead of taking that color and remixing it, creating one homogeneous color that's a little bit more red, you can take a color that is very different, like an actually red color, and just put that on top of that surface and mix it in, and kind of stand back and see whether that does the trick. And if it doesn't, then you can keep adjusting it. But this way you can create a much more interesting kind of surface color, rather than just taking one color and just filling it in like a paint by numbers kind of exercise. So the surface that the mangosteens are sitting on is kind of a bit of a reflective wood surface. So it's going to have a lot of the blue and the white kind of coming through from the background, being reflected into it, and the mangosteens themselves should be a little bit reflected in them as well. So even though when you look at some object and it may, like, in your mind it seems like, okay, well, that's a brown object. Once you start painting, you have to kind of analyze it. Well, is it really brown? Am I seeing brown here, or am I seeing something more, more bluish, or more orangish, or more pale, or whatnot? And with these colors, it's also, everything is like a building up of colors. So, it doesn't have to be perfect the first time. Grab some colors that feel right and put them on the canvas, put them on your painting. See how they feel, and then adjust right on the canvas, right on your painting surface. And you'll get much more lively results, much more interesting results than just trying to guess the color right away and trying to get it perfect on your palette. Because once it goes on your painting, it changes. Like it becomes a different color because it's now related to all the other colors that are next to it. Like those shadows, they may seem kind of brown, but then I realize that there's a lot of that blue that gets reflected back into those shadows. And it's different in front of the mangosteen and to the side of the mangosteen. To the side, there's a lot more blue kind of coming from the background, and in front, they're definitely much more brown and darker. So I want to try to get that captured in this early stage as well. And it may seem like a lot of things to kind of think about. So, if you're just starting out, it's also perfectly fine to just try and mix colors on your palette and try to get them right. But, as you become more comfortable with painting, it's not a bad idea to just keep these things in mind that I'm talking about, and try to apply them here and there. And it might seem weird and wrong, kind of scary to put like purple where the color is clearly brown, but somehow it all kind of works in the end, and as long as you don't go too crazy with the colors, then things tend to work out. There's a little bit of a highlight right along the edge of that surface where there's a little bit more light that gets caught. And so right now I'm kind of fighting with that initial drawing line that I put down, which was very dark, and so trying to kind of get that figured out. So now that I have a little bit of a background color on the surface and in the background, it feels a lot more comfortable to try to start building up the main subject. Because now you can see, okay, what's the darkest part? Like how dark are the darkest parts of the fruit compared to the background color, compared to the setting that they're in. And then also, as I'm working on the edges, it's perfectly fine to kind of let the edges bleed into the background a little bit. And just kind of blend with the background. Because, there's a difference between a round object that sort of curves away from you and goes towards the background, and a square object that where there's a really hard edge between the background and the surface. And when there's a more of a rounded curving shape, then that edge is going to be much softer and kind of much more blended with the background color. You can see it as if you kind of notice and pay attention closely at the thing that you're painting. So now all I'm doing is just I'm seeing colors in the skin of these mangosteens, and I'm just dabbing them here and there to see what they feel like. And if they feel right, I keep them, and if not, then I continue building and adding more colors. The fun part about this is that it's not like an orange or a lemon where it's just like yellow or orange. There is so much variety in the texture in these guys that it's really fun to kind of try to paint them and figure out all the different colors that live there. And before I get too far with the highlights of the mangosteens, I want to make sure that I block in the shadows and the dark parts of the stems and the leaves as well, which are, they're pretty brown. I guess these guys have traveled pretty far. I'm sure when they were first picked from the trees, they were green and lush, but they had to travel all the way to New Jersey, so they've lost a little bit of their brightness along the way. So they're kind of like a pale brownish green color. So now I'm beginning to add a little bit of the the lights to these mangosteens, and to make that color, all I did was added some of that yellow that I used on the surface of the table, and because I'm mixing it with the base color, which it has a lot of alizarin crimson, that color turned pretty purple. So I still want a little bit more yellow in there, so I'm going to go over that and fix it up a little bit later. And the reflected color on these guys is even more yellow because there's even more of that wood surface color being reflected in, up into the flesh. So I'm adding a little bit more of that yellow color into it. For the color of the leaves, I'm going to get a little bit of cerulean blue and mix it up with some white and some yellow ochre and a little bit of cad yellow, and just kind of go back and forth until I find way off to begin with. But if it's way too off, if it's too intense, then you might have trouble later on kind of trying to fight with that color. So I want to be somewhat close to begin with. They're really more yellow than green, kind of beige, these leaves. And then the middle tones are more in the brown family. So I'm using some burnt sienna and some yellow ochre for that. Still not necessarily going into the details, just kind of laying some strokes here and there to try to identify the colors and the values. And then I don't want to forget about the little kind of crevices that create the darks that I identified when I was drawing. And at this stage, things may look kind of like a bit of a mess up there, sort of undefined and very loose. But because I already drew these guys and I kind of know where things are, I'm not quite as concerned with it. If I hadn't drawn it, I would be sort of tempted to go much further into the details and kind of define the drawing first before going in with these kind of rough, sort of big brush strokes. But this, having done the drawing, the study of the tops, it sort of frees you a little bit. It makes it a little bit easier to play around a little bit with loose kind of shapes and colors and not worry so much about the drawing, because that's going to come into focus, because every stroke that I'm making is in the benefit of the overall structure of those leaves. And it's just like with figure painting or figure drawing. You know, even if I leave it loose, it'll still feel like things are in the right place and in the right kind of amounts, because I have that drawing in the back of my head. And when I originally put down those reflected lights, I think I made them a little too bright, so I'm kind of going back in now and just toning them down a little bit The other thing to kind of keep a note on with reflected lights is that there's an edge to it. So the light doesn't reach all the way down to the bottom of the subject. As you get to that place where the fruit is touching the ground, that becomes really dark, and the dark is both on the fruit and on the table as well. So the reflected light will kind of tone down and get darker towards that edge. And all I wanted to do here was just add some more of that pure kind of blue paint behind the stems, fill in some of those gaps, and just have something to mix into a little bit. I was feeling a little thin down there, or up there. Now you can see from the reference photo that I'm still pretty far off in terms of color. The light part on this front mangosteen is actually much more brown and yellow than the one in the back. The one in the back has a kind of a purplish tint. The one on the left also. But this one has a little bit more kind of, I guess it's where it got a little scuffed up. The result is sort of this yellow tone in the highlight, in the light part of the fruit. Very similar to actually the color of the leaves on top. And I'm just trying to define a little bit the light and shadow on the leaves as well, which helps to give those guys a little bit of form. Can't forget about the leaf behind the stem as well. And it really doesn't take a lot to give these guys form. And I'm really, trying to fight the urge to get in there with a smaller brush, with a sable brush, to get in on all the details. But I think eventually I might have to. I think when I paint, sometimes there's that struggle between keeping things loose versus trying to get things fully defined. And sometimes things just kind of happen naturally. And I think that when you get to a point where everything just kind of happens naturally and very instinctually, that's when you have something special. You can sort of allow your instincts to take over when you're painting, and then let kind of nature and intuition take over. I think if you can do that and and sort of be surprised sometimes by what happens with your painting, I think that's when you begin to sort of approach what I consider to be art. It's something that's almost not conscious, something that sort of happens on its own, as if God is talking to you through you, or nature is talking through you, and you're just a paintbrush. But you can't get there by just completely letting go of your control and just it's not something that happens right away. It's something that happens with a lot of practice and a lot of hours spent painting. And that's why we continue to work and put in our 10,000, 20,000 hours, because we want to be a sharp tool for the creator. And we want to have all those little things in place. The studying of a drawing in order to be able to more instinctually put down brush strokes. All of that is in the service of being a sharper tool. I think with this painting, I sort of felt that, once I started kind of going into the working on the texture and also working on those leaves, I kind of let go and just let my eyes guide me, and my instinct kind of take over, and just find little pieces of color on my palette and just throwing them down as I see them, as I feel them on the panel. And I think that, I think if you can walk away from your painting and feel surprised a little bit and feel delighted, then I think other people will too. I don't know if you agree about this painting, once you see it finished. I don't know if you will agree with that, but, to me it is. To me that there was something interesting happened in the middle of the process there. But these little bits of color, like, they're adding cadmium red and mixing that with yellow ochre. And that's just sort of, looking at the surface and just kind of trying to pick out some of those different colors that happen within there. And then once you put it down on the painting surface, on your painting, seeing whether that feels right, constantly checking back and forth between the painting and the subject, and seeing what else is missing and what else is begging to be added, and just being honest with that. And it's really not necessarily copying what's in the subject. It's not necessarily being, trying to be one to one. Okay, this is the number of little scratches that it had, and etc. No, I think I'm starting with nature, starting with what the subject is telling me. But at a certain point, the painting kind of takes over, and it becomes its own thing. It becomes its own piece of nature, made up of brush strokes to create an image. And so, I'm not overly concerned about things not being exactly the way that they are in my subject. I wanted to make sure that what happens on the canvas is beautiful and feels natural and feels pleasant. And whether it looks exactly like what's my subject is a bonus sometimes, but it's not crucial. It's not necessary. More, after I finish this painting, I'm going to eat some of these mangosteens, so they're going to be gone. They're going to be gone forever, but the painting will remain. And that's the thing that's more important, actually, even than the subject. That's at least how I think about it. These shadows are kind of interesting. They sort of don't make sense because they're almost lighter than the light part of the surface. But I think what's happening is that blue background is being reflected in the kind of shiny surface. And so you're getting almost the same kind of blue as the background, but not quite. And it only it only happens where you can see past the fruit into the background. It doesn't happen right in front of the fruit. And that's because but on the edges we get a lot of that blue, and because it's reflecting off of the yellow surface, it's almost like a type of a green color, which is what I'm trying to mix up right now. It's still darker than the background, than that blue. Just kind of working it back and forth and mixing in with the color that's there. So what's on my palette is a little bit more intense than what the final color comes out to, because it's getting mixed with the base color there. It seems the brightest right next to that bottom right edge of the mangosteens. Now those shadows are getting a little messy, so I think I'll clean them up a little bit. That helps a little bit. Now the shadows, the drop shadows, they tend to be softer. The edge gets softer the further it is from the subject. Yeah, back there it seems like I've left the shadow a little too wide. So we'll rein it in a little bit. Okay, that's looking a little better. I want to bring up some of the darks in the mangosteens a little bit, because they're kind of getting a little bit lost. Like some of that drop shadow especially is nice to emphasize. And that same blue is also getting reflected around the edges of the mangosteens. So same way that it gets reflected in the surface, it sort of skirts around the edge and then gets reflected off of the sides. Of course, I don't want it to be too blunt, so I'm going back in with my shadow color and just toning that down a little bit. And the same thing with this one. Now when I put down this color, even though it's blue on the palette, because it mixes with a lot of that alizarin crimson in the base color, it tends to be a little bit more pink, which in a way kind of works pretty well because it sort of melds with the subject a little bit more. as a way to kind of draw the lines around the things. Even using a thick brush, you can create a pretty precise sort of contour by using the edge of it. Now I want to work a little bit on the highlights. And the highlights on the surface are, it's not like a white kind of blotch. It's kind of similar to what you would do on a lemon or an orange, where it's little bumps that kind of catch light here and there. And it never really goes to complete white, as it's more of it's not a very shiny surface, so you don't get that pure reflected white light. It's more like a leathery surface. Now, just like the background is reflected in the surface that my subject is on, so do the mangosteens. So the color in front of them is a little bit darker and a little bit sort of redder than the rest of it. So I'm just trying to capture that now. And then through these little holes between the mangosteens, then there's a little bit more light kind of coming through. And those parts become brighter. And then on the outside of that, there's more blue is being reflected in that wood surface, and so that gets a little bit cooler overall. Suddenly we're getting a little bit of air coming through the painting. Ran out of white. All right, time to take stock and see what's missing. Let's see, take a look at the painting and take a look at the photograph and see what you would still do to change to this painting. Some things here are choices and some things are still not done. Like the overall color, I kind of like them being this little bit more vibrant, more purple. It's the color that you see when you look at the fruit kind of up close. The photograph has a little bit of a yellowish tint to it, which is, the white balance on the camera, on the phone. But with your eyes, you see things a little bit differently. But other than that, I think there's a couple of things that are still in need of some attention. Obviously, the stems and the leaves on top are still very rough. I think the edges could be worked out a little bit better. And the shadows right now are a little simplistic. Those kind of deep purple shadows could use a little bit more detail, because even though they're dark, there's still details there that you can see. And then what I'm doing right now is just adding that reflection within the shadow of that. And the same thing with the one on the left. There's a definite kind of semicircle at the bottom of each one of them that you can see. So now I'm switching to a sable brush, which is a much softer brush that allows me to kind of create some hard lines. And I'm going to use that to kind of redefine that some of the darkest darks that I sort of lost as I was working on the colors around them. And on this size of a panel, when it comes to those tiny details of the stems and the leaves, I really it's not very easy to use the big bristle brushes and still have things be convincing. So that's why I'm switching to this thinner brush. And technically, I could still use the bristle brushes, but it's just a little easier this way. And as long as I don't, resort to kind of rendering things, and keep things loose still, even while using the smaller brush, everything will feel kind of homogeneous and not out of place. So once I get to the smaller details, it's still the same thing. I'm still trying to identify my lights and darks to describe the forms there. And having already gone through the exercise of drawing them, that makes things a little bit easier. Sort of gives me a little reminder of where things are. And I'm using a rod to lean on the edge of my painting in order to be able to stabilize my hand. Gives me something to rest my hand on. Slowly they're coming together. There's a lot of details that are, that I'm not gonna capture here. Like there's little, kind of ridges on those stems that I try to put down like a line or two just to have a little indication there, but without necessarily drawing all of them out. And then these leaves, they're kind of interesting in that there's a little lip that kind of comes up. There's that circular part, that the overall shape of it, but at the edge there's a little lip that kind of comes up. It's very characteristic of this fruit. So I'm trying to give little tiny indications here and there of those things. Give it a little bit more character and detail. And then switching to a bigger brush if I need to kind of define some bigger forms. I don't want to be painting them in with a tiny brush. I think these first two, the one on the left and the middle one, look like they're just about done as far as the tops are concerned. The back one still needs a little bit more attention. The stem on the middle one is a little bit more kind of brown, so I'm gonna try to adjust that a little bit. It's sort of a little too pale yellow right now. Kind of lost the little details that I had on there before. It's got a little bit of a green in it as well. All I'm doing is just trying to make little adjustments here and there as I see them in the subject. Again, kind of going more towards the reddish brown on those leaves. All right, I'm gonna paint for a little while and just let it kind of run. But in the meantime, I wanted to ask the viewers here, what made you click on this video? You interested in painting mangosteens? I mean, this is a pretty far spot in the video. It's about an hour, 5 minutes in. So I imagine that people who are watching now this far into the video are pretty committed. So I'm just curious. You know, when you saw that this video was about painting mangosteens, what made you click on it? Doesn't seem like a very typical subject. Are you a painter yourself, or are you learning how to paint? I don't know. I'm just curious about my viewers a little bit. I see all those numbers racking up, but I don't really know, you know, who all is watching. So yeah, leave a comment. Let me know, you know, what stage you're in, whether you're a painter or student or just like to watch painting videos for relaxation. Anyway, drop a comment, give me a follow if you're not following already. And it'd be great if you tell your friends about this channel. You know, let people in, build a following. Maybe it'll inspire me to post a little bit more often. There's that edge that was bothering me. Gotta round that out a little bit. At a certain point in the painting, you kind of begin to feel like maybe you're overworking certain areas. And that time is sort of it's a tricky spot, because usually when you feel like you've overworked something, then you've kind of messed it up, and you do need to bring it back to some kind of a focus. So I don't know, somewhat feeling like that a little bit on the leaves there. I think it's going to turn out fine in the end. And now I want to just bring in a little bit more details to the surface, kind of add a little bit of texture to the shadows. Every part of this fruit should feel like you could touch it. It should feel tactile. And if it looks a little vague, then that's where I choose to add a little bit more texture. There are all kinds of little scratches and dents and marks on it, and they tend to catch some light even in the shadows. I have to be kind of careful with the highlights. I want to make it look like it's, you know, the texture is right. And so I can't be using too much white there. But I still want it to feel like you can kind of bounce a quarter off of it, like it's solid. So I'm using like little dabs of this lighter color. And breaking it up into kind of little patches. By the way, have you ever tried a mangosteen before? They're pretty delicious. It's not like any fruit that you can compare it to. You cut them open, they have this very thick, leathery skin. And inside there's these delicate white wedges that are really sweet and tart. My daughter was the one that kind of wanted to try them. She read about them somewhere, and so we got some. And that was a couple of years ago, and we've been buying them ever since because they're such an interesting fruit. Can't always find them in the stores, but if you can, I highly recommend you try them. So I think we're getting pretty close to being done here. And I think I'm pretty happy with the way this one turned out. I think I was able to keep it overall very loose. That bottom edge of the wood is feeling a little simplistic with that, just that kind of simple brown. So I'm bringing a little bit of a complementary color in there, a little bit of green, which made it feel a little bit more alive. And also I'm doing the same thing here in the shadows, kind of adding a little bit of greens just to kind of balance out those bright reds and pinks. Again, this is just something that's, you know, as I'm looking at it, I feel like it needs to go towards a certain direction. I'm just adding a little bit of that color there. And sometimes it works, sometimes it feels right, and sometimes it doesn't. In this case, it's sort of working out. And one thing that's starting to get lost is that spot at the very bottom of the fruit where the fruit is touching the surface, and that's the darkest part. That should be the darkest part of the painting. A place where very little light comes in, so I'm going to use they're sitting on the surface more. Sorry about the background noise. I have my kids are coming down. it's snack time in the house, so I think maybe they're waiting for me to finish with these guys so they can devour them. All right, I think this painting is just about done. I think it came out pretty good. I don't know. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you've ever had these. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, I'd really appreciate a follow. I mean, you've made it this far into the video, might as well commit at this point. And yeah, if you have friends that like painting, why don't you share this channel with them as well? That'd be greatly appreciated. And yeah, I'll be posting more videos like this. I have, these days I paint a lot, but I don't necessarily post a lot because these videos do take a fair amount of effort to create. It takes me a while to edit them and add the VO. I do the VO after I paint. So I have a full hard drive worth of painting videos that eventually will get posted. So some of the other things that I've painted there's some glass, there's a lot of kind of shiny metal objects. I have a martini shaker that I've painted recently. I have some transparent glass, all kinds of fruits and vegetables. I grow a lot of my own vegetables and I like to paint them. So look for some of those in the future as well. Yeah, until next time, thanks for stopping by. I hope you enjoyed this video. Like and follow. All right, thank you. Bye-bye.